The iron gate was taller than I'd imagined. I stood there on the sidewalk, staring up at the gold-plated address numbers. 4782. My son's new house. I'd only seen it in the photo he'd texted me 6 months ago. Just the front entrance, nothing else. No invitation to visit. No, come see it, Mom. Just a picture with the caption, "Finally made it." I pressed the intercom button. My finger trembled slightly. I'd rehearsed what I'd say on the entire bus ride over, holding the lemon cake on my lap the whole way. His favorite. The one I used to bake every birthday when he was small. The speaker crackled. A man's voice came through, professional and flat. I told him I was there to see Michael Brennan, that I was his mother, Dorothy Brennan. I heard papers rustling on the other end, then silence. A long silence that made my stomach drop. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed. Uncertain, almost apologetic. He told me there'd been some kind of mistake, that Mr. Brennan's mother had already arrived 20 minutes earlier, that she was inside right now. The cake slipped in my hands. I caught it just before it hit the pavement, but the plastic lid popped open and a corner of the frosting smeared across my coat. I stood there staring at the intercom, then up at the security camera pointed directly at my face. My mouth opened, but no words came out. The line had already gone dead. Inside that mansion, someone else was being called Michael's mother. I'm Dorothy, and what I'm about to tell you still doesn't feel real, even now. Before I go on, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? I always read the comments, and if you enjoy stories like this, go ahead and subscribe, so I can share more with you. I need to go back a bit, so you understand how I ended up standing at that gate, holding a cake that was falling apart, being told I wasn't who I knew I was. Michael had always been my only child. His father died when he was 7, a heart attack, sudden and cruel, the kind that doesn't give you time to say goodbye. After that, it was just the two of us in our small house on Maple Street. I worked double shifts at the diner to keep the lights on, to keep him in good clothes, to make sure he never felt like he was missing anything. I wanted him to have everything I never did. He was a smart boy. Not just school smart, but clever in ways that surprised me. By the time he was in high school, he was already talking about business, about investments, about making something of himself. I didn't always understand what he meant, but I loved watching his eyes light up when he explained his ideas. I'd nod and smile, stirring my coffee, just happy to hear his voice fill the kitchen. When he left for college, I cried for 3 days straight. The house felt too big, too quiet, too empty. I'd set the table for 2 out of habit, then remember and put 1 plate back. I'd cook his favorite meals and end up freezing the leftovers in little containers, telling myself he'd want them when he visited. But the visits became shorter, then less frequent, then almost non-existent. After college, he moved to the city, got a job at some big firm I couldn't pronounce. He'd call every few weeks and I'd ask how he was, if he was eating well, if he needed anything. He always said the same thing. He was fine, Mom. Everything's fine. His voice sounded distant, distracted, like he was answering emails while talking to me. I told myself he was just busy. That's what successful people are. Busy. Then he met Vanessa. I only saw her once, at a coffee shop halfway between my town and the city. She was beautiful in that polished way. Perfect hair, perfect nails, a handbag that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She smiled at me, but it never reached her eyes. She asked polite questions and checked her phone every few minutes. Michael seemed different around her, stiffer, like he was performing. I tried to like her. I really did. I bought her a scarf for Christmas, something soft and blue that I thought would suit her. She thanked me, but I never saw her wear it. Michael told me later that blue wasn't really her color. I remember nodding, feeling foolish, wondering when my son had become someone who cared about things like that. They got engaged 6 months later. I found out through a text message. Just a photo of her hand, the ring glittering under restaurant lighting, and the words, "She said yes." I stared at that photo for an hour, zooming in on the ring, on her smile, trying to feel the joy I knew I was supposed to feel. I texted back congratulations with 3 heart emojis. He sent back a thumbs up. The wedding was small. At least that's what he told me. I wasn't invited to the planning. wasn't asked about flowers or music or cake flavors. Vanessa's mother handled everything, he explained, and she had very specific ideas. I understood. Or at least, I told myself I did. On the day of the wedding, I sat in the third row, wearing the same dress I'd worn to my sister's funeral, because it was the only formal thing I owned. I watched my son marry a woman I barely knew, surrounded by people I'd never met. At the reception, I tried to talk to him. I found him by the bar, laughing with a group of men in expensive suits. When he saw me approaching, his smile faltered for just a second. He introduced me. "This is my mom, Dorothy," and the men nodded politely before turning back to their conversation. I stood there for a moment, holding my small clutch purse, feeling invisible. Then I went back to my table and ate my salmon in silence. After the wedding, the calls stopped almost completely. I'd try reaching out, leaving voicemails that went unanswered. I'd send texts asking how he was, if they were settling into married life, if they needed anything. Sometimes he'd reply days later with a brief message, "All good, Mom. Talk soon." But soon never came. I started seeing updates on social media instead. Photos of them at fancy restaurants. Vacation pictures from places I couldn't even locate on a map. And then, one day, the photo of the mansion. That's when I realized how far he'd gone. How far away from me he'd traveled, in every sense of the word. I'd wanted to visit so many times. I'd typed out messages asking if I could come see the new house, if maybe I could make dinner for them one night. But I always deleted them before sending. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to be the mother who couldn't take a hint. So I waited. I waited for him to invite me, to say the words I needed to hear. "Come over, Mom. I want you to see it." But that invitation never came. The months dragged on. I kept working at the diner, kept living in the same small house, kept sleeping in the same bed where I used to read Michael bedtime stories. I'd lie awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I'd done wrong, wondering when I'd become someone my own son didn't want to see. Then came his birthday, April 23rd. I'd never missed one, not in 32 years. I woke up early that morning and started baking. The lemon cake, his favorite since he was 6 years old. I made it exactly the way I always had, from scratch, with real lemons, with the cream cheese frosting he used to lick off his fingers. I packed it carefully in a plastic container, got dressed in my nicest blouse, and took 3 buses across the city. I didn't call ahead. I didn't ask permission. I just went. Because he was my son. Because it was his birthday. Because I really thought, that maybe seeing me would remind him of something. Of home. Of us. The neighborhood was nothing like ours. Wide streets lined with trees whose names I didn't know. Houses, no, estates, set back from the road behind gates and hedges. Everything looked clean, quiet, expensive. I felt out of place in my old coat and worn shoes, clutching my cake like it was something precious. When I finally found the address, I just stood there for a minute, staring. The house was even bigger than in the photo, all glass and stone and sharp angles. There was a fountain in the front yard, an actual fountain. I thought about our house on Maple Street, with its peeling paint and creaky porch steps, and felt something twist in my chest. But I'd come all this way. I couldn't turn back now. I walked up to the intercom, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I pressed the button, heard that flat, professional voice, told him who I was, who I'd come to see. And then he said those words, those impossible words that made the ground shift beneath my feet. Someone else was already inside. Someone else claiming to be Michael's mother. I stood there at that gate, the smeared cake in my hands, and felt 32 years of motherhood dissolve into confusion, into something worse than confusion, into fear. Because if I wasn't Michael's mother, if someone else was inside playing that role, being welcomed while I was turned away, then who was I? What had I become to my own son? I looked down at the cake, at the frosting I'd made with my own hands, at the recipe I'd memorized decades ago, back when Michael would stand on a stool beside me in the kitchen, helping me crack eggs, getting flour on his nose. The security camera stared down at me. Cold. Unblinking. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening inside that house, who was pretending to be me, and why my son, my Michael, had let it happen. So I did something I'd never done before, something that surprised even me. I rang the doorbell of the house next door. The neighbor who answered was a woman in her 60s, wearing gardening gloves and a concerned expression. She looked at me, at my smeared coat, at the ruined cake, at whatever desperation must have been written on my face, and invited me in without hesitation. Her name was Patricia. She made me tea I didn't drink and sat across from me in her sunlit kitchen while I tried to explain. I told her I was Michael Brennan's mother, that I'd come to visit him for his birthday, that someone else was inside his house claiming to be his mother. Patricia's face changed as I spoke. Not with disbelief, but with something else. Something that looked like recognition, like she'd been waiting for this conversation. She asked me to wait a moment. Then she left the kitchen and returned with a photo album, the old-fashioned kind with plastic sleeves and handwritten dates. She opened it to a page marked with a ribbon and turned it toward me. There, in a photograph from what looked like a neighborhood barbecue, was my son. And next to him, her hand on his arm, smiling like she belonged there, was a woman I'd never seen before. Patricia told me her name was Claire, that she'd been coming to Michael's house for about 8 months now, that she introduced herself to all the neighbors as his mother, talked about how proud she was of him, how she'd raised him to be the successful man he'd become. Patricia had thought it was lovely at first, a mother and son with such a close relationship, until she met Claire at a garden party, and something felt off. The way Claire talked about Michael's childhood didn't sound quite right, Patricia explained. The details were vague, generic, the kind of stories anyone could tell about any child. And when Patricia mentioned she'd grown up in the same state Michael was from, Claire changed the subject quickly. Too quickly. I sat there staring at the photograph. Claire was elegant, probably in her early 60s, with silver hair styled in a way that probably required weekly salon visits. She wore pearls, real ones, from what I could tell. Her smile was perfect, practiced, the smile of someone who knew exactly how to fit into this neighborhood, into this world my son had built. Patricia leaned forward and touched my hand. She told me she'd suspected something wasn't right, but she'd never imagined this, that the real mother, me, had been replaced. She asked if I wanted her to call the police, but what would I tell them? That someone was pretending to be me? That my son was letting it happen? I didn't even know if it was a crime. It just felt like betrayal. I asked Patricia what she knew about Claire, where she came from, how she and Michael had met, but Patricia only knew what the neighborhood knew, that Claire was charming, that she attended all the social events, that she seemed to make Vanessa very happy. That last part struck me. Vanessa. Of course this was about Vanessa. I remembered the wedding, the way Vanessa's mother had controlled everything, the way I'd been pushed to the margins, made to feel like I didn't fit. And now I understood. I didn't fit. Not in their world. Not in the life Michael had chosen. So they'd found someone who did. Patricia offered to let me stay, to help me figure out what to do next. But I couldn't sit still. I thanked her, took the photo she offered to print for me, and left through her back gate. I walked along the hedge that separated the properties, my mind racing, my heart pounding, until I found a spot where I could see through to Michael's backyard. There was a party happening. I could hear laughter, the clinking of glasses, music floating through the warm afternoon air. I crouched behind the hedge, feeling ridiculous and desperate, and watched. People in expensive clothes mingled on the stone patio. Servers in white shirts carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. And there, in the center of it all, was Michael. He looked so different. Older, yes, but also harder somehow. His smile was the one I remembered, but it seemed painted on, automatic. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Vanessa stood beside him, her hand on his back, laughing at something someone had said. And then I saw her, Claire. She emerged from the house carrying a cake. Not my lemon cake, but something elaborate and professional, covered in fondant and gold leaf. Everyone gathered around as she presented it to Michael. I watched him hug her, watched him kiss her cheek, watched him introduce her to guests as his mother. My legs went weak. I had to grip the hedge to stay standing. The branches bit into my palms, but I barely felt it. I was watching my son celebrate his birthday with a stranger playing my role, and he looked happy, relieved even, like he'd finally gotten the mother he'd always wanted. Someone nearby laughed, and I heard Claire's voice carrying across the yard. She was telling a story about Michael as a child, about how he'd always been so ambitious, so driven. The details were all wrong. Michael hadn't been ambitious as a child. He'd been quiet, thoughtful, a boy who collected rocks and read books about dinosaurs. But no one there knew that. No one there knew the real Michael, the one who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, the one who cried when his goldfish died and insisted we have a funeral in the backyard. I watched Vanessa lean into Claire, laughing at something she'd said. They looked comfortable together, natural, like they'd known each other for years. And maybe they had. Maybe this had been planned long before today. Maybe I'd been erased slowly, carefully, replaced piece by piece until there was no trace of me left in my son's life. The cake was cut. Champagne was poured. Michael made a speech I couldn't quite hear from my hiding spot, but I saw him raise his glass toward Claire, and everyone applauded. I felt something crack inside my chest, something I didn't know could break any further. I needed to leave. I needed to get away before someone saw me crouching in the bushes like a criminal. But my feet wouldn't move. I kept watching, kept torturing myself with the sight of this life my son had built without me. This perfect, polished, expensive life where I didn't exist. Then Michael's phone rang. I saw him pull it from his pocket, glance at the screen, and his expression changed. Just for a second. He looked uncomfortable, guilty. He stepped away from the party, walking toward the far end of the patio where it was quieter, and answered. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I watched his body language, the way he ran his hand through his hair, the way he kept glancing back at the party, at Claire, at Vanessa, the way his shoulders tensed. Whoever was on the other end of that call was saying something he didn't want to hear. When he hung up, he stood there for a moment, staring at his phone. Then he looked up, directly at the hedge where I was hiding. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. For one terrifying second, I thought he'd seen me, but he was just looking past me, toward the street, his expression troubled. He returned to the party, but something had shifted. He wasn't smiling anymore. He kept touching his pocket where his phone was, like he was expecting another call. Vanessa noticed and asked him something, but he shook his head and forced a smile. Claire approached him with another glass of champagne, and he took it but didn't drink. I realized I was crying. Silent tears running down my face, dripping onto my coat, onto the ground. I wiped them away with the back of my hand, but they kept coming. I thought about all the birthdays I'd celebrated with him, the homemade cakes with uneven frosting, the small presents wrapped in newspaper because we couldn't afford proper wrapping paper, the way he'd hug me and tell me I was the best mom in the world. When had I stopped being enough? When had I become someone to hide, to replace, to erase? I finally forced myself to move. I walked back through Patricia's yard, thanked her again, and made my way to the bus stop. The ruined cake was still in my hands. I'd been carrying it this whole time without realizing it. I found a trash can near the corner and threw it away. The lid wouldn't close over it, so I just left it there, frosting and all, a small monument to everything I'd lost. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Michael had chosen this. He'd chosen Claire, chosen this life, chosen to pretend I didn't exist. But why? What had I done that was so terrible he couldn't even bear to have me at his birthday party? I thought about calling him, confronting him, demanding answers. But what good would that do? He'd already made his choice. He'd already decided I wasn't the mother he wanted. That Claire, with her pearls and her perfect smile and her fake stories, was a better fit for the life he'd built. When I got home, the house felt emptier than ever. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, too tired to turn on the lights, and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. The grief, the anger, the humiliation, the crushing weight of being unwanted by the person I'd given everything to. My phone sat on the table in front of me. I picked it up and scrolled through my messages with Michael. Years of one-sided conversations, my questions, his brief replies, my attempts to stay connected, his polite distance. I'd been so blind. I'd thought he was just busy, just adjusting to his new life, but he hadn't been adjusting. He'd been erasing. I almost put the phone down, almost let it go, almost accepted that this was how things would be from now on. But then I noticed something. The last message he'd sent me was from 3 weeks ago. Just 2 words. "Thanks, Mom." I'd sent him money for his birthday. $50 I could barely afford. And he'd thanked me with 2 words. But there was something else. A message I'd forgotten about. From 2 months before that. I'd asked him if everything was okay, if he needed anything, if he wanted to talk. He'd replied, "I'm fine. Don't worry about me." And then, a few minutes later, another message. One I'd somehow missed in the chaos of my daily life. "I'm sorry." I stared at those 2 words. I'm sorry. Sorry for what? For abandoning me? For replacing me? For letting me stand at his gate like a stranger while someone else played mother to him? Or was it something else? Something I hadn't understood yet? My hands were shaking as I typed out a message. I deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Finally, I wrote something simple, something honest. "I came to see you today. For your birthday. I brought your favorite cake, but they told me your mother was already there." I hit send before I could change my mind. The message showed as delivered, then as read. I watched the 3 dots appear, disappear, appear again. He was typing, stopping, typing again. My heart hammered in my chest. What would he say? Would he apologize? Explain? Deny? The dots disappeared. No message came. I waited. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10, nothing. He'd read my message and chosen not to respond. That hurt worse than anything else. Worse than the gate. Worse than watching him with Claire. Worse than being thrown away like the cake I'd made with love. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Because something Patricia had said kept echoing in my mind. Something about how Claire's stories didn't quite add up. How the details were wrong. And I realized that if she was lying about his childhood, about raising him, then Michael knew. He had to know. Which meant this wasn't just about replacing me. It was about hiding me. The question was, why? What was my son so desperate to hide that he'd hire or convince a complete stranger to pretend to be his mother? I stood up from the table, turned on the lights, and made myself a cup of coffee. Then I sat back down and started making a list. Everything I knew. Everything I'd seen. Everything that didn't make sense. Because if Michael wouldn't give me answers, I'd find them myself. And when I did, he was going to regret the day he decided I wasn't good enough to be his mother. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. My eyes were swollen from crying. My body ached from exhaustion, but my mind was sharp. I knew what I had to do. I got dressed in my best clothes. The navy blue dress I'd worn to Michael's graduation, the one that still fit if I held my breath. I put on makeup, something I rarely did anymore. I wanted to look like someone who belonged, someone who couldn't be dismissed. I took the bus back to that neighborhood, but this time I didn't go to Michael's house. I went to Patricia's. She answered the door in her robe, surprised to see me so early, but she let me in without question. I told her I needed her help, that I needed to know everything she knew about Claire, where she lived, where she came from, how she spent her time when she wasn't playing mother to my son. Patricia hesitated at first. She said she didn't want to get involved in something that might turn ugly, but then she looked at my face, really looked at it, and something in her softened. She poured us both coffee and started talking. She told me Claire lived alone in a condo downtown, that she drove a silver Mercedes, that she volunteered at the country club and played tennis every Tuesday morning, that she seemed to have money but no family, no photographs in her wallet, no stories about anyone but Michael. I wrote everything down in a small notebook I'd brought. Patricia watched me, concern etched on her face, and asked what I was planning to do. I told her the truth. I didn't know yet, but I needed to understand who this woman was, why she'd agreed to this, whether she was being paid or manipulated, or if she had her own reasons for wanting to be someone's mother. Patricia gave me one more thing before I left. A business card. She said she'd found it in Claire's purse once, months ago, when they'd been at a charity luncheon together and Claire had asked her to grab her reading glasses. The card was for a high-end event planning company, the kind that organized weddings, galas, corporate functions, and on the back, in handwriting that wasn't Claire's, were 3 words: Mother of Groom. I stared at that card for a long time. Mother of Groom. Not mother, not Mrs. Brennan. Just a role, a part to play, like an actress in a production. And suddenly everything made a horrible kind of sense. This wasn't about Michael rejecting me. This was about Vanessa creating the perfect life, the perfect image. And I didn't fit the script. I spent the rest of that day following Claire. I know how that sounds. I know what it makes me. But I was past caring about dignity or propriety, or what anyone might think. I waited outside her building until she emerged in tennis whites, carrying an expensive-looking racket. I followed her car to the country club, stayed in the parking lot while she played her match, watched her laugh with women who looked just like her, polished, wealthy, comfortable in their skin. When she left, I followed her to a salon, then to a boutique, then to a cafe where she met another woman for lunch. I sat 3 tables away, hidden behind a menu, and listened to their conversation. They talked about vacations and renovations and their children's accomplishments. Claire mentioned Michael twice, called him brilliant, said he was launching some new business venture. The other woman asked if she'd always known he'd be so successful, and Claire smiled and said she'd seen it in him from the start. Every word was a lie. Every smile was borrowed. Every story was stolen from a life she'd never lived. And the ease with which she did it, the comfort she felt in this deception, made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about money or status. Claire enjoyed this. She'd found a role that gave her purpose, belonging, an identity she'd apparently never had on her own. After lunch, she drove to a florist. I watched through the window as she ordered an expensive arrangement. The florist asked who it was for, and Claire said it was for her son's office. A congratulations bouquet for his new partnership. I didn't even know Michael had made partner. He hadn't told me, but he'd told her. Or Vanessa had. Or maybe Claire had just made it up. Another piece of fiction in the story of her perfect son. I followed her back to her building and waited in my car until evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and I sat there thinking about all the evenings I'd spent alone in my kitchen, wondering why my son never called. All the birthdays and holidays I'd celebrated in silence, telling myself he was just busy. All the excuses I'd made for him because loving him was easier than accepting the truth. Around 7, Claire emerged again. This time she was dressed for dinner. Elegant black dress, the pearls, heels that clicked against the pavement. She got into her car and drove toward Michael's neighborhood. I followed, my heart pounding, knowing where she was going, knowing that tonight, I'd finally confront this woman who'd stolen my identity. She pulled up to Michael's gate. The security guard waved her through without question. Of course he did. She was expected, welcomed. I parked down the street and watched her disappear through those gates that had been closed to me. Then I got out of my car, walked up to the intercom, and pressed the button. The same voice answered. The same professional tone. Before he could speak, I said I needed to speak with Michael Brennan, that it was urgent, that I was his mother, his real mother, and if he didn't let me in, I'd call every newspaper in the city and tell them about the woman inside pretending to be me. There was a long silence. Then the speaker clicked off. I waited, counting my heartbeats, wondering if he'd believed me or if he was calling the police. Then the gate began to open. Slowly, like it was reluctant, like it knew what was about to happen and wanted to give everyone time to prepare. I walked up that long driveway alone. My legs shook with every step. The house loomed above me, all glass and angles and cold perfection. I could see lights inside, shapes moving behind the windows. I could hear music playing softly, and I could feel my entire body trembling with a mixture of fear and rage and grief so profound it threatened to swallow me whole. The front door opened before I reached it. Michael stood there, backlit by the chandelier in the foyer, and for a moment we just stared at each other. He looked older up close. tired. There were lines around his eyes I didn't remember. His hair was starting to gray at the temples. When had that happened? When had my son become this stranger? He didn't say hello, didn't invite me in. He just stood there blocking the doorway, his hand gripping the frame like he needed support. Finally he spoke, and his voice was quiet, defeated. "Mom, you shouldn't be here." I asked him why. Why shouldn't I be in my son's home? Why shouldn't I celebrate his birthday with him? Why was there another woman inside claiming to be me? My voice cracked on that last question, and I hated myself for it. I'd wanted to be strong, dignified, in control, but standing there looking at him, all I felt was broken. He glanced over his shoulder, then stepped outside and closed the door behind him. We stood on his porch, in the warm evening air, and he finally looked at me, really looked at me. I saw guilt in his eyes, and shame, and something else, something that looked almost like grief. He told me he was sorry, that he never meant for it to go this far, that it had started small, just Vanessa asking him to be vague about his background at social events. Her family came from old money, old society, and they had expectations, standards. His real story, the small house, the dead father, the mother working double shifts at a diner, it didn't fit their narrative. It made them uncomfortable. So he'd started editing, leaving things out. When people asked about his childhood, he kept it brief, generic, unremarkable. And Vanessa's mother had been so relieved, so pleased. She'd told him he was smart to keep his past private, that successful people didn't dwell on where they came from, only where they were going. Then came the wedding planning. Vanessa's mother had taken control, as I'd witnessed, and she'd made it clear that certain aspects of Michael's life needed to be managed. I was one of those aspects. Too working class, too unsophisticated, too likely to say or do something that might embarrass them in front of their society friends. Michael had defended me at first. He swore he had. But Vanessa had cried. Her mother had threatened to withdraw their financial support for the wedding, and he'd been weak. He admitted it standing there on his porch, his voice barely above a whisper. He'd been weak and ambitious and desperate to fit into this new world he'd worked so hard to enter. After the wedding, it had gotten worse. Vanessa's family had expected them at constant social events, gallery openings, charity galas, country club dinners, and people always asked about family, about background, about mothers. Vanessa's mother had come up with the solution: hire someone to play the role. Someone elegant, polished, with the right accent and the right manners. Someone who could tell the right stories and make the right impression. Claire had been perfect. She was a widow with no children of her own, a woman who'd once been part of this world but had fallen on harder times after her husband's death. She needed the money, needed the belonging, and she was a natural actress. It was supposed to be temporary, just for a few events, just until things settled down. But Vanessa had liked her, had wanted her to stay, had started including her in more and more of their lives. And Michael, weak, guilty, trapped in the lie he'd created, had let it happen. He'd let Claire become his mother in every way that mattered to his new life. And he'd let me disappear. I stood there listening to him confess, watching tears stream down his face, and I felt nothing. No relief at finally understanding. No satisfaction at hearing him admit his guilt. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where my love for him used to live. I asked him one question. Just one. Did he ever think about me? On his birthday, on holidays, on ordinary Tuesday afternoons? Did he ever remember the woman who'd raised him? Who'd given up everything to give him a chance at the life he now lived? He nodded. Said he thought about me all the time. That guilt ate at him every day. That he'd tried to find a way to fix it, to make it right, but he was in too deep. He'd told so many lies, constructed such an elaborate fiction, that bringing me back would destroy everything. His marriage, his career, his entire carefully constructed identity. So he'd made a choice. He'd chosen the lie over the truth, chosen his new mother over his real one. And he was sorry, so sorry. But he didn't know how to undo it. He didn't know how to be both the man he'd become and the son I'd raised. The door behind him opened. Vanessa appeared, her face pale, her eyes moving between us. She'd heard everything. Behind her, in the lit hallway, I could see Claire standing frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth. They'd all heard. The whole ugly truth had finally been spoken out loud. Vanessa looked at me, and I saw something unexpected in her expression. Not anger or defensiveness, but shame. She asked Michael if what he'd said was true, if her mother had really orchestrated all of this, if he'd really been hiding me for years because I wasn't good enough for their world. Michael couldn't answer. He just stood there crying, his perfect life crumbling around him, unable to defend himself or his choices. And in that moment, I realized something. He wasn't the son I'd raised. That boy, the one who'd collected rocks and feared thunderstorms and cried at goldfish funerals, he was gone. This man wearing his face was someone else entirely. Someone I didn't recognize and didn't particularly like. I told him I forgave him. Not because he deserved it, but because carrying hatred would only poison what was left of my life. I told him I hoped his new mother brought him happiness, that his expensive house and important career and polished wife gave him whatever it was he'd been searching for. And I told him he didn't need to worry about me showing up again. I wouldn't embarrass him, wouldn't disrupt his carefully constructed world. I'd go back to my small house on Maple Street and let him pretend I'd never existed. Vanessa reached for my arm as I turned to leave. She said she was sorry, that she hadn't understood, that her mother had convinced her this was normal, that ambitious families often curated their image, that it was just business. She said she'd make Michael fix it, make him tell the truth, make him bring me back into his life. But I pulled my arm away gently and told her not to bother. You can't force love. You can't manufacture family. Michael had made his choice, and I was making mine. I chose my dignity, my truth, my small, honest life over his big, beautiful lie. I walked down that driveway one last time. Behind me, I heard Vanessa and Michael arguing. I heard Claire apologizing, her voice high and panicked. I heard the sounds of something expensive breaking, maybe thrown against a wall. But I didn't look back. I just kept walking toward the gate, which stood open now like a mouth waiting to swallow me. Patricia was waiting by her mailbox when I reached the street. She must have been watching, waiting to see what would happen. She asked if I was okay, and I told her the truth. I would be, eventually. She walked me to my car, and we stood there for a moment in the gathering darkness. She told me she admired my strength, that walking away took more courage than fighting. I wasn't sure I believed her, but I thanked her anyway. Then I got in my car and drove home, leaving that neighborhood and everything in it behind. The days that followed were strange, quiet. I kept expecting Michael to call, to show up at my door, to try to apologize or explain or fix things. But he didn't. The silence was absolute. And gradually, I realized it was what I wanted, what I needed. Space to grieve not just the loss of my son, but the loss of the illusion I'd been carrying for years. The belief that love and sacrifice were enough to keep someone close. I started filling my days differently. Signed up for a watercolor class at the community center. Started volunteering at the library on weekends. Made friends with the woman who lived next door. Someone I'd nodded at for years but never really talked to. I began building a life that didn't revolve around waiting for phone calls that never came or making excuses for someone who didn't want to be found. 3 months after that night on Michael's porch, an envelope arrived in my mail. Inside was a check for $50,000 and a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. It said the money was from Michael, that he wanted to help me, that he hoped I'd use it to make my life more comfortable. There was no apology, no explanation. Just money, as if he could pay off his guilt in installments. I stared at that check for a long time, thought about all the things I could do with it, the repairs my house needed, the debt I'd been carrying, the security it might bring. But I knew that if I took it, I'd be accepting his version of our relationship, one where I could be bought, managed, kept at a comfortable distance with occasional payments. So I tore it up, every piece, let the fragments fall into the trash like snow. Then I sat down and wrote my own note. Just 3 sentences. I don't want your money. I wanted my son. But that person doesn't exist anymore. I mailed it to his office. Never got a response. Have you ever lost someone who was still alive? Tell me in the comments. I always read everyone. And if this story touched your heart, subscribe so I can share more with you. Sometimes the hardest part of love is knowing when to let it go.